Good morning. I'd like to welcome you back to another edition of our Anchored in the Word morning reflection. And this week we've been dealing with the story of Mary and Martha, and it's a fascinating passage of Scripture. Yesterday we talked about the importance of the effectiveness, really, of Martha's service and the fact that it's not just all negative. But today what we're going to do is we're going to go a little bit below the surface, and we're going to see that there's more to the story than just what meets the eye. And so let's go ahead and read Luke chapter 10, verses 38 through 42 again, and then we will dig into our next principle. Here's what it says. Now it came to pass as they went that he entered into a certain village, and a certain woman named Martha received him into her house. She had a sister called Mary, which also sat at Jesus' feet and heard his word. But Martha was cumbered about with much serving, and came to him and said, Lord, dost thou not care that my sister hath left me to serve alone? Bid her therefore that she help me. Jesus answered and said unto her, Martha, Martha, thou art careful and full of trouble about many things, but one thing is needful, and Mary hath chosen that good part which shall not be taken away from her. Yesterday we talked about the importance of hospitality and service in the church, and God uses our labors. But today I'd like us to step back and recognize another principle that is being drawn out of the text in front of us. And that principle is that you cannot judge the ultimate value of service by what you immediately see and what is immediately accomplished. And notice the word ultimate value. I'm not saying that a service that we do, it can have multiple levels to it, I guess is how I would put it. And so when we look at a thing, we need to recognize that there could be more to it than we see. And that can go in really one of two directions. We could look at something that at the time does not seem like it's really going to accomplish very much, but in the long term, we see the long-term value of it. We may see something that appears to accomplish an incredible amount, but then over the long term, we see that it doesn't. We may have a person that we're a bit skeptical of their motivation, but as time goes on, as that person goes through challenges, we begin to recognize that in fact their service was properly motivated, and they're a very humble person, they're a faithful person, they're willing to sacrifice, and they are internally motivated correctly. And we see that in the long term. We could have another person that appears on the front side to be doing things extremely well, and then later on they're a great disappointment. So that takes us back to the principle you cannot judge the ultimate value of service by what you immediately see or what is immediately accomplished. And notice what Jesus says to Martha in verse 40 when Martha comes to him. He says, Martha, thou art cumbered about much serving. And the word cumbered means that you are overwhelmed with care and frustration. There's a lot going on inside of your heart. Martha was doing the right thing, but what she was doing and what was being accomplished, while it was good, had a deeper below the surface problem with it. It wasn't what she was doing, it was why she was doing it. It wasn't even what was being accomplished, it was why she was doing what she was doing. And I will state that it is nearly impossible for us to be able to judge motives. Now, I use the word nearly because motives do eventually work themselves out in people's lives. So we can't necessarily judge a person's motives initially, but as time goes on, there will be indicators of what's going on below the surface. As I mentioned earlier, sometimes we give people more credit than is actually due them. And I'm going to give you an example of Paul talking about this in another passage. Sometimes we do not value the work that is being done in front of us, and it's being done out of a pure motive, and in the long term it's going to be an extremely productive thing. Time is generally what reveals the true value of one's labors. I can give you a personal illustration of when I was a missionary and we were on deputation. And I remember us going to our very first deputation stop. We were at a missions conference. And I had a brother who came and he began to talk to me about what we were doing when it came to raising our support. And he asked me, he's like, how long have you been doing this? And I told him this is our first trip, our first deputation spot. And he said, well, how many meetings do you have lined up? And I said, well, I think I've got about 30, 35 meetings lined up through the end of the year. And he said, well, you need to be in a different church every single service. You need to be in 150 to 200 churches, not 30 to 35, because you're never going to get to the field if you follow the pattern that you're following. And I said to him, well, my approach is I want to spend time in a place, and I want them to get to know me, and I want to get to know them. And I want to prioritize my visits based on the relationship that I have with these churches, if we are philosophically on the same page, and if they want to get behind what we're doing, I think that we'll very quickly raise up our support. Well, the truth is that at the time, what he was doing and what I was doing hadn't been tested. But a year later, guess what? The approach that we took actually was a great approach, because we ended up on the field. And that didn't start with us. It was by the advice of other people and them sharing philosophically what they thought was a good way to go about that. It was by me hearing their perspective and learning from them that I chose to take a different path than what this particular brother in Christ was doing. And so in the long term, one was actually better than the other. And at the beginning, one may have appeared to be better than the other when it actually was not. And so we see some examples in the scripture of this. In 1 Corinthians 4, Paul talks about the fact that he had many, many critics. But he says, even though I have critics, this is how I approach this. He says in verse 3, with me, it is a very small thing that I should be judged of you, or of man's judgment. Yea, I judge not mine own self. For I know nothing by myself, yet am I not hereby justified, but he that judgeth me is the Lord. Therefore, judge nothing before the time until the Lord come, who both will bring to light the hidden things of darkness, and will make manifest the counsels of the heart. And then shall every man have praise of God. Now, what is the Apostle Paul saying? He's saying, I'm doing the work of ministry, and there are people in the church of Corinth who are very critical of what I'm doing. They're critical of my motivation. They're critical of my approach to ministry. They're critical of the things that I'm saying. And he says, you know what? I don't know of anything in my conscience that I'm doing wrong here. That doesn't mean that the Apostle Paul was sinless, but he's saying my approach to ministry, I'm doing it out of a clear conscience. But here's what he says. Even though my conscience is clear on this issue, that doesn't mean that I'm right. That doesn't mean that maybe some of these criticisms aren't valid. I can't see them at the moment, but they might be. And so Paul says, ultimately, the judgment seat of Christ is going to determine the true nature, the true quality of the work that I'm doing. So basically what Paul is saying is, withhold your judgment. Don't let me, I'm not allowing the criticisms to get me down. I'm gonna keep my focus. I'm gonna keep the course charted in front of me. That's what he's saying. Another example is when Paul was concerned about the future of the church at Ephesus. And in 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 22, he says, lay hands suddenly on no man. And he's not talking about grabbing somebody. He's talking about the ordination of a new pastor elder. And so he says, don't quickly appoint people to the office of pastor, overseer, elder. You need to be very cautious that you allow some time to demonstrate the true character of this person. And so he says it this way, don't be a partaker of other men's sins. Keep yourself pure. Some men's sins are open beforehand, going before them to judgment. Some they follow after. Likewise also the good works of some are manifest beforehand, and they that are otherwise cannot be hid. So basically Paul's saying is, in a very quick evaluation of a person's character is not going to give you the true picture. So allow there to be some time for the situation to play out and for a person's true character and true motives to come to the surface. Some people's motives are pure, but they don't appear that way at the beginning. And time will demonstrate that, in fact, this is a faithful, reliable, godly individual, a good candidate to be appointed to church office. Another person may look like a great candidate, and if we rush to put them into that position, we will one day really regret that. So the point of this whole discussion this morning is that you cannot judge the ultimate value of service by the immediate, what you see, and the immediate, what is accomplished. Time is the ultimate revealer of those things. Pressure is the ultimate revealer of those things. We need to see the long-term effects of what's going on. And so Jesus is going to get into this issue because Martha needs to recognize that long-term effectiveness and a truly pure service has to be properly motivated on the heart level. And that's where we're going throughout the rest of the week. I hope that this has been an encouragement to you. My prayer is that as we think about these things, the Lord would purify our hearts, He would refine us, so that the way that we serve Him is in fact the correct way from a pure motivation. Have a blessed morning. Lord willing, we'll talk again tomorrow. Bye now.